Before we talk about cattle, we need to talk about aurochs because they're the wild ancestors of every single cow, bull, and ox on Earth today. Aurochs, scientifically known as Bos primigenius, were absolutely massive animals. We're talking about bulls that stood nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed over a ton, basically the size of an elephant. According to some ancient descriptions, they had enormous curved horns that could span over 3 feet from tip to tip. They were fast, aggressive, and absolutely fearless. Julius Caesar, writing in 50 BCE about his campaigns in Gaul, described aurochs like this: "Their strength and speed are extraordinary. They spare neither man nor wild beast which they have espied." He noted that young men would hunt them as a test of courage, and that even capturing them as calves couldn't tame them. "Not even when taken very young can they be rendered familiar to men and tamed," he wrote. These weren't animals you could just walk up to and pet. These were apex megafauna, powerful, dangerous, and dominant across their range, which stretched from Europe through Asia and into North Africa. Cave paintings from 17,000 BCE show aurochs prominently featured, making them the third most commonly depicted animal after horses and bison. Our ancestors clearly had complex relationships with these creatures, hunting them, fearing them, and perhaps even worshipping them. The last known aurochs died in 1627 in Jaktaro Forest in Poland, after surviving ice ages, climate shifts, and tens of thousands of years of human hunting. They finally went extinct due to habitat loss and diseases transmitted from their own domesticated descendants. It's one of history's bitter ironies. So, when and where did humans first domesticate aurochs into cattle? The answer comes from cutting-edge genetic research and archaeological evidence, and it's pretty incredible. Around 10,500 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, the region encompassing modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, something remarkable happened. Genetic studies examining the DNA of ancient cattle bones found at archaeological sites have revealed that all taurine cattle, the humpless cattle of Europe, Africa, and Western Asia, descended from an incredibly small founding population. How small? According to research published in 2012, modern cattle genetics suggest that only about 80 wild aurochs were successfully domesticated in the upper reaches of Mesopotamia. The most likely locations were near the villages of Kayu and Tepesi, in what is now southeastern Turkey, and Jad el Magara in northern Syria. Just 80 animals. That's it. That tiny founding population gave rise to over 1 billion cattle alive today. Think about that for a second. Every Holstein, Hereford, Angus, and Longhorn traces its maternal lineage back to fewer than 100 wild aurochs captured and bred by Neolithic farmers over 10,000 years ago. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Cattle domestication didn't happen just once. There were actually 2 major domestication events, and possibly a third. Around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, in the Indus Valley, modern-day Pakistan, a different population of aurochs was domesticated independently. These became zebu cattle, or Bos indicus, the humped cattle adapted to hot, arid climates of southern Asia and Africa. Zebu cattle acquired their characteristic hump only after domestication, which shows how quickly selective breeding can change animals. There's also contested evidence for a possible third domestication event in northeastern Africa, though genetic research increasingly suggests that African cattle are actually descendants of the Near Eastern taurine cattle that migrated to Africa and then hybridized with local aurochs populations. The debate continues among scientists. Okay, so here's the million-dollar question. How did Neolithic farmers actually domesticate creatures that Julius Caesar said couldn't be tamed even when caught as calves? The answer is time, patience, and selective breeding over many generations. First, consider that by 10,500 years ago, humans had already successfully domesticated sheep and goats. They had learned the principles of animal husbandry, how to control breeding, select for desirable traits, and manage captive animal populations. But sheep and goats are relatively small and manageable. Aurochs were a completely different challenge. The process likely started with capturing young calves, possibly orphaned ones or those taken during hunts. The boldest, least aggressive, and most tolerant of human presence would have been kept and bred. Over generations, and we're talking dozens or hundreds of generations spanning centuries, the cattle became smaller, more docile, and more manageable. Archaeological evidence shows that domesticated cattle in the early Neolithic were substantially smaller than wild aurochs, though still larger than modern breeds. Their horns became shorter or sometimes disappeared entirely through selective breeding, since farmers no longer needed cattle with massive defensive weapons. Interestingly, genetic evidence shows that as domestic cattle spread through Europe between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, local farmers deliberately interbred their domestic cows with wild Aurochs bulls. This is called backcrossing or hybridization, and it helped diversify the domestic gene pool and possibly improved traits like size and hardiness. Y chromosome studies show that North European cattle breeds have significantly more Aurochs bull genetics than South European breeds, suggesting extensive local hybridization occurred. This wasn't a clean, simple process. It was messy, complex, and happened differently in different regions. But the end result was the same. Fierce, untamable Aurochs gradually became manageable domestic cattle. Once cattle were domesticated in the Near East, they spread everywhere. Humans went hand, they transformed every place they reached. From the Fertile Crescent, domestic cattle migrated into Europe along two main routes, via the Mediterranean coasts and along the Danube River. By 7000 BCE, cattle had reached Greece. By 6000 BCE, they were in the Balkans. By 5000 BCE, they'd spread through Central Europe and reached the North Sea coasts. Cattle also migrated into North Africa from the Near East between 6000 to 5000 BCE, where they became foundational to pastoral societies. The emergence of cattle herding in Africa, particularly in the Nile Valley and Sahara region, marked a pivotal moment in the continent's history and helped give rise to ancient civilizations. In Asia, Zebu cattle spread from the Indus Valley throughout the Indian subcontinent and eventually into Southeast Asia and East Africa. They adapted to tropical climates where Taurian cattle struggled, becoming the dominant cattle type in hot regions. When Europeans began exploring and colonizing the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries, they brought cattle with them. Spanish conquistadors introduced cattle to Mexico and South America. English colonists brought cattle to Virginia and New England. These cattle populations exploded in the New World, particularly on the vast grasslands of Argentina, Brazil, and the American Great Plains. Today, there are over 1 billion cattle worldwide. They're found on every continent except Antarctica. The global beef market alone is worth over $332 billion annually, and that doesn't include dairy, leather, or other cattle products.